disassemble the VM-68 trigger group. First thing I would do is knock out the over travel sear pin. Second thing I would do is push out the sear pin, and now you can remove your sear. Third, we have the trigger pin. Now careful, because there's a lot of parts with little springs. So what we have here, we have the trigger, the trigger latch, that's what I'm going to call it anyways. So trigger latch, you have a pin that goes through the trigger with the trigger latch spring, you have the trigger return spring, and the trigger pin. Over here we have the sear pin, sear over travel pin, and the sear spring. When you remove the trigger, I don't recommend taking the sear latch off, but if you do remove it and you're looking to put it back on, the notched end here goes on the passenger side of the trigger. The latch just goes on the driver's side of the trigger. The spring goes on the farthest left, farthest to the left. This groove here will latch onto the trigger spring, so make sure that's coming out of the passenger side of the trigger. So it's time to reassemble the trigger pack. The first thing I recommend putting back in is the trigger with the trigger spring and the trigger pin. First, I get the trigger and the trigger latch together with the pin, spring, and latch all in place. Don't worry about this spring, just put it in place for now. You want to have the little arm catching underneath the sear latch, but don't worry about the actual springy bit. We can do that later. Next, take the trigger spring and just catch it into the notch like that. Now don't worry about lining up the pinhole that's on the trigger and the hole in the spring. We can do that later. For now, just hold everything together. Just pinch it all together. Oh, make sure that you've got the two holes facing towards the front of the trigger. And just slide it in there. And just hold the spring in place with the sear pin for now. So now it is caught with the notch on the trigger, and the sear pin is holding the spring in place. And the arm of the spring is properly in place along here. So now, just pull the trigger back slightly like this. That'll rotate the pinhole into position as you're pushing down. Push forward on the trigger and rotate the end down. There you go. Now that you have the trigger installed into the trigger pack, that's the hard part over with. You'll notice that the trigger latch is loose. If you've done it properly, you should have this this little hook towards the front of the gun, and that's actually going to spring against the latch. But right now, we're not going to have any spring tension, because this little end is loose. So what we're going to do is we are going to push this pin here and just tuck that little end of the spring underneath it. So to do this, I just use an Allen key, and I slightly depress the pin in enough so that I can get that spring by. You don't want to do it enough where you're going to free up the trigger and pin. You just rotate it through and take an Allen key and push that spring down. And then just push the sear pin in place. And now you should have spring tension on your sear latch. Now the easiest part of installing the trigger group is adding the sear. You'll want it sitting like this with the flat part towards the bottom of the gun. The sear and spring go together like this. So you will have this little bit hooking underneath that arm there. And sitting on the driver's side. So to install that, just place them into the trigger mechanism, drop the pin in, and just fiddle around until the pin goes through. And then just hook that spring around. And if you've done it right, it'll be like that. Now you can just press it down, and you want to push the trigger latch so that it goes underneath, and it should lock in place like that. Now the last component is the over travel and sear, and that just drops into place there, and your VM trigger group is ready to go. So to test for functionality, just pull the trigger, pull forward on the sear latch, and it should pop up, and then reset. Thanks for watching, guys, and hopefully that helps you guys put your VM-68s back together.